And thank you for the invitation to be here today in London. It's my first trip to London outside of the airport. So it's fantastic to be here and to enjoy the city a little bit. Today I will focus on biotechnology, and it's a topic that we've been discussing in the United States in the wheat industry for a number of years now. And my thesis was well over 10 years ago, so a topic that I've been involved in and researching and looking at for a number of years. So, and I think it's a topic that you will also be talking about more and more in the future here in the UK as well. So a little bit about US Wheat Associates to start my presentation. US Wheat Associates is a farmer-based organization. We have a board of directors made completely of farmers that represent 19 of the major wheat-producing states across the United States. So our work is export market development. We provide market information, technical information, trade information to customers around the world. And we do that through a network of 16 offices around the world, operating market development activities in roughly 90 different countries. So we are very much engaged and in touch with customers that are using wheat in mills and bakeries with government officials around the world. And as Michael said, I was based in Cairo for a number of years. And I do have to say that your team is doing their work, because I would often see HGCA and UKS and UKP materials around at different offices and officials that I would visit with. So you guys are out there doing your good work as well. A little bit of what's happening in biotechnology. This is a headline from the ISAAA, and they do a report every year, an annual report of what's happening in biotechnology. Back in 1996, there were 6 countries that were producing biotech crops. Today, there are 29 different countries producing 12 crops that have biotech traits included in them. So it's been a remarkable advancement in the adoption of producing biotech crops around the world. In addition, ISAAA reports that there's 30 additional countries that are importing biotech crops. So between the 29 countries that are producing, the 30 that are importing represents roughly 75% of the world's population has some exposure to biotechnology. I also believe that it's interesting when we look at the adoption rate. We see the blue line is developed countries. And you can see developed countries were very rapid in their adoption of biotechnology. But you can see in recent years that adoption rate has been increasing much more rapidly in developing countries. And developing country farmers also seeing some major benefits from using biotechnology in their farming practices. Now, my first question to you, I do like to ask questions when I'm giving presentations, is we have 12 crops listed here. I think there are 2 major crops that are not included. Does anybody want to shout out what those might be? Wheat? Rice. You guys are really, really good. So what's happened in biotechnology and wheat and rice and other crops? The chart on your left is a graph of different regulated field trials that we've had in the United States. And this chart goes back to 1987. So research began in biotech crops in the US roughly in the mid-'80s. And that was mainly focused on corn and soybeans. You can see that wheat is lagging behind here. Wheat is several categories back on the x-axis there from other crops. You've got corn, soybean, cotton, potatoes, tomato, finally wheat being looked at for research in biotech crops. We look even farther back and we find rice. So there's been about 430 trials in the United States since about the mid-1990s on wheat. We look at corn, there's been almost 7,300 different trials looking at biotech traits in corn in the United States. So we are definitely lagging behind in terms of the research and development that's happening in crops in the United States. Wheat is a vital crop, though. The FAO has stated that wheat represents roughly 20% of the caloric intake around the world. So even though we are one of the major crops being consumed around the world, very little research into the biotech traits. So what's been happening and why are we so concerned about looking at new technologies in wheat? Roughly 20 years ago, wheat was the king in the United States. We were the top acreage, as you can see by the red line. more acreage planted than in corn, more acreage planted than in soybeans. And you can see the trend that has happened here for wheat in the United States, and you see the trends that have happened in corn and soybeans, as Jack and David also pointed out, as what's happening around the world. So we have definitely moved down to a distant third, and that gap, as you can see, has been increasing each year as well, that each year that we move forward with wheat plantings and corn plantings and soybean plantings. And one of the reasons is biotechnology. There's several reasons that come into this, but biotech definitely is one of the factors. And wheat also may get pushed farther down as we look at new traits coming into corn and soybeans. As we have a drought-tolerant corn that may be coming out soon or perhaps next year, as we look at new technologies that are coming out in corn and other crops, it will push wheat to more marginal land and possibly continue to lower our acreage number for wheat. So my next question to you is, how many football or soccer fans do we have here? Rugby fans? A few? Okay. Well, I thought this was maybe just a little bit more illustrative to show what is happening to wheat. I mean, corn is really doing well, beating us up, and soybeans and corn there as well. But I'm still pulling for Team Wheat. So I'm hoping that we can move forward with new technologies into bringing more productivity to the wheat industry. Now, this isn't just happening in the United States. We look at our neighbor to the north, also a major wheat exporter, and we can see harvested acreage in Canada also declining at a fairly rapid rate. And that is being offset mainly by an increase in oilseed acreage. Now, again, biotech is not the only reason, but biotech canola or rapeseed has been available since the mid-90s as well. And we can see what's happened in Canada with acreage. A similar story happens in our harvested spring crop, the high-protein crop that is imported by the UK and across Europe. We see that our acreage in our northern tier states that are producing harvested spring also reducing significantly in terms of acreage, and mainly due to competitiveness that we have with other crops. So what's happening in the world? Jack showed this chart earlier, and he included soybeans as well, which has a similar trend to corn. But wheat has been pretty stagnant over the last several years. And actually, if we go back for a 30-year period, we're down roughly 5.5% in wheat acreage around the world. And we see corn acreage increasing at roughly 33%. And if we put oilseeds up there, we'd see a similar trend of increasing acreage. Now, land is a scarce resource, obviously, and wheat needs to compete for that land. And we have to do that through productivity. And we look at productivity for the different crops. I just put corn and wheat up here. But this graph shows yield per metric ton per hectare for the US as well as for the world, what the averages are. And we look at the top line, we see US corn yields increasing fairly significantly. I think one of the very interesting points in this slide, though, is that we look at 1996, the last little bump that we have, a large drop in yield. That was the first year that biotech corn was planted, or biotech crops were planted. And we look at how much more smooth that volatility has become in yield growth in corn. And again, that is a lot due to improved genetics. And we look at what's happened for wheat yields. The blue line is US wheat yields, and the black line, world wheat yields. And we see that the US wheat yields have not increased nearly as significantly as they have for corn. In fact, corn yields have increased roughly 4 times as fast as wheat has since 1990. And the last slide in the competitiveness chapter that I have looking at what's happening in the United States in terms of acreage trends, as we look at what a farmer can receive per hectare of land or per acre of land. And if a farmer had the option of growing these 3 different crops, these are USDA baseline numbers, I think it's pretty clear as to what crop that they would be producing based on those returns per acre. This includes input costs and of course, the revenue from selling the crop. And corn, roughly $1,100, $1,200 per hectare, a pretty nice return. Soybeans, around $900 wheat a far distant third there in terms of the return per hectare and to attract more acreage into growing wheat in the United States. So what have we done? We sat down as an industry in 2006 and started looking very, very closely at how can we change this equation for wheat? What is the competitiveness factors that can be done, that we can implement, that we can look at to improve wheat's competitiveness with these other crops? And in 2006, we held our first wheat summit. So I don't know if anybody has heard of the wheat summits that we've done in the United States. We've now done 4 of them to talk specifically about how can we improve wheat to make it more attractive to farmers to produce. So the wheat summit meetings included the entire industry, from the seed trade to the country elevators, to the producers, to the flour millers, to the bakers, to the technology providers, to the exporters, all along the entire chain to sit together to talk about what's happening, how can we reverse these trends in wheat to keep wheat attractive and to keep it being produced. As part of that, we also have a Wheat Industry Biotech Council. And the Wheat Industry Biotech Council is a smaller group that meets every so often to discuss issues as we look forward to the commercialization of biotech wheat, and to discuss what the concerns are, what the market acceptance issues are, and along the whole chain of approvals to planting of biotech wheat, to have a robust and transparent discussion on how we bring biotech wheat forward. For the producer organizations in the United States, we actually have 2 different organizations. We have the U.S. Wheat Associates, which I represent, working on export market development, and we have the National Association of Wheat Growers, and they work on domestic policy issues and are doing a lot of work on biotechnology and wheat as well. And since the late 1990s, we've actually been meeting jointly through a joint biotechnology committee to look at producer interest in biotechnology and what producers can do and what our needs and our focus will be on bringing biotechnology into wheat going forward. So as part of the Joint Biotechnology Committee, we went through and had a very long discussion about what principles, what factors do we need to support biotechnology in wheat and to bring it towards commercialization. So we have developed and adopted, both of our board of directors, a Principles of Commercialization document. And this is located on our website. It's very transparent. It's also on the NOG website as well. But it lists out several factors in terms of what producers see as important for bringing biotech wheat into commercialization. The first one is an informative dialogue with developers of biotech traits, so we can do educational and outreach activities as we go forward, so that the market is not surprised, that it's transparent. We also require regulatory approvals in major export markets. And we define major export markets as those markets that represent more than 5% of annual export volume. That's roughly today 6 different countries would fit that criteria. That there are tolerances in place for non-GM commercial shipments, realizing that there will be a market for GM wheat, there will be a market for non-GM wheat, and that 0 is not possible. So that there are workable tolerances to provide choice to customers that still require non-GM wheat. That there are accurate and timely trait tests available to test for biotechnology events in shipments for those buyers that require non-GM wheat. That there's stewardship of the technology, that growers are educated about proper buffer zones and rotations and what's needed to produce this crop for that contamination or commingling is minimized or doesn't occur, and that a way to capture value. Because obviously for a seed company to have a biotech trait, they have made a substantial investment in that biotech trait, and they do need to capture that value back as well. In addition to the principles of commercialization, we started reaching out around the world to different organizations that also had interest in biotech wheat. And this was a trilateral statement signed with wheat producers in Australia and Canada in 2009. And this statement was really, I think, a game changer in terms of showing interest in biotech wheat around the world. Because you had not just the United States, but you had producers that had committed to looking at biotech as a technology to improve productivity around the world in Canada and also in Australia. And basically, it just states out the concerns that the wheat industry's had in these different countries as to why we need to look at new technologies. Biotechnology being one of those technologies, but a variety of technologies to improve productivity. Concerns about the supply of wheat in the world and the importance of wheat in the diet around the world, as I mentioned, representing 20% of calories consumed across the world. That wheat was facing problems in diseases, fungal diseases, insects, sawfly, aphids, whatever they might be. That there were nutritional benefits potentially with biotech traits in wheat. Water, obviously drought tolerance, and just having plants that would more efficiently use water. Frost, I mentioned nutritional and healthy products, perhaps increased fiber, different starch properties, that there were several possibilities with new technologies that should be explored for wheat. A recognition that wheat acres were declining. The slides that I showed you earlier about the loss of acres that wheat has had to other crops. That wheat yields are advancing slower than they are in corn, oilseeds, other crops around the world as well. And a statement that biotechnology has been a proven technique over the last 10 years with strict regulatory scrutiny and over 10 years of records. I mean, biotech crops are one of the most studied food products, I think, that we consume today. When you look at the regulatory aspects and the requirements in the United States, as well as the regulatory approvals in other countries around the world, these traits and crops have been looked at by many different scientists, many different countries, and have been proven to be safe, safe for environmental, for food safety, and not one problem that has been arisen from the use of biotech crops. And we also recognize that there is a brain drain, for a lack of a better word, in research in wheat. And bringing new scientists, new breeders into wheat to help advance the productivity that we see that we need to increase yields around the world. So with those two documents, several of our wheat leaders went around and started having meetings. And in 2008, we met with several technology developers, the research and development companies, to start having this discussion of attracting new scientists or new research, new dollars into the wheat industry. And I have put down a timeline of events or activities that have happened since 2008. And this is also on our website to take a look at as to what has happened. It's been pretty exciting, actually, when you look at what's happening in wheat since 2008. Before, roughly in the US, 70% of our varieties were public varieties. So that was done through our state wheat commissions, through checkoff funds like you pay here in the UK. And that money was being channeled to universities to develop new varieties. And those varieties are very, very good and have a strong germplasm background. But we only had about 30% private sector involvement in the wheat industry, much different than it was for corn and soybeans. So now we have several private companies that have entered into the wheat breeding fora. And we have Syngenta acquiring different wheat seed companies, Dow Agro announcing collaborations. Monsanto acquired a breeding company as well back in 2009. We have public-private partnerships with these private companies and with public institutions, such as CSIRO in Australia. In addition, we had more interest in looking at other types of technology besides biotech. Syngenta decided to get back into the hybrid business. And hybrid wheat is another alternative to increase productivity per acre using more conventional techniques. We had Syngenta announce a public-private partnership with Simit to work on wheat breeding. Lima grain cereals, which had not been very active in North America before, set up an operation in North America to look at biotech traits with North American varieties. We had Arcadia Biosciences and Vilmorin get active with Lima grain in the United States to look at new traits. Public-private partnerships have started now with private companies and public universities. And there are a few of these that have occurred. Probably the largest one so far is Monsanto with Kansas State University looking at hardened winter wheat varieties. BASF and Monsanto are working more closely on bringing traits to the marketplace as well. In addition, Monsanto was getting more active in Australia with their 20% roughly collaboration with Intergrain to look at new traits and varieties in Australian germplasm. Again, Virginia Tech with Monsanto to look at soft-red winter wheat. We had Bayer Crop Science set up a collaborative with the Evo gene. And they just made an announcement a couple weeks ago that they've made a lot of progress already in looking at markers and different wheat varieties. And looking at where we just had a few markers previously in wheat identified, now there are hundreds to thousands of markers being identified in wheat that will help advance germplasm as we move forward. Bayer Crop Science setting up a collaborative with the University of Nebraska and setting up their North American wheat breeding program in Nebraska as well. And again, more purchases of different wheat breeding companies around the world. So looking at germplasm, not just in the United States, but germplasm in different countries around the world, and looking at what traits might be available and that germplasm to improve productivity overall. And again, a few other investments that have been made in just 2012 to continue this trend of looking at how wheat productivity and the investment in wheat to bring new varieties to the marketplace. So that was a lot of information, right? But that information is on our website. You can see what's been happening in terms of research and development and interest in wheat by these different private companies. I just want to turn now a little bit to what's happening specifically in the US in terms of field trials. So we have many different trials that have occurred in the United States, roughly, as I mentioned, over 400 trials that have occurred since roughly the mid-1990s. In 2011, we had 12 trials that were slated for the US looking at biotech traits in wheat. This is a pretty big jump from the last couple of years where the research had kind of quieted down after the mid-2000s when Roundup Ready wheat was shelved, and we kind of took a little break in looking at biotech and wheat. But this is starting to ramp back up again. And we're looking at a lot of different traits in wheat. It's not just herbicide resistance anymore, as I mentioned previously. We're looking a lot at the abiotic stresses. So how can we use new technology to look at drought resistance, at heat resistance, at frost or cold resistance? We're looking a lot at nitrogen utilization efficiency. I mean, how many nitrogen is a pretty big input cost, I think, for a lot of wheat farmers. So how can a plant better utilize that nitrogen to produce the same yield or to increase yields by applying the same amount of nitrogen that we do today? And there's a lot of very interesting work and research that's being done by Arcadia Biosciences in this field. And some of their research that I've seen so far using canola is pretty extraordinary. We're looking at diseases in insects. Insects, as you are here in the UK, diseases such as Fusarium head blight, which causes mycotoxins in wheat, and how we can improve yields and also provide some better food safety through lowering mycotoxins in the final product. Pretty exciting work being done in Australia on starch characteristics and lowering the glycemic index of wheat. So making the starch so it does not absorb into the body or through the bowel as quickly as wheat does today, and providing some nutritional benefits in that method. And then also there is work being done on herbicide tolerance as well to be used perhaps in combination with these different traits that are being looked at. So as I mentioned Australia. Australia is also very much moving forward on biotech wheat and looking at various field trials. There's also work being done in China, Argentina, Australia, or India, excuse me, and hopefully next year I can add the UK to this list as well. It's pretty exciting news that there's a field trial being started next year here right in your home country. We do realize that there are concerns with biotech wheat, and those concerns, we need to have that conversation with the entire industry, with consumers. Consumer and customer acceptance is a key. And nobody wants to produce a product that nobody's going to buy. In the United States, we export roughly 50% of what we produce. So export market channels and customer acceptance is extremely important to us as we look at bringing biotechnology into the marketplace. There's protection of export markets, as I just mentioned. There's our domestic market as well that has to be very much on board, in which we're doing a lot of discussions and openness with the industry through this Wheat Industry Biotech Council and through these wheat summits that I've mentioned before. There's retail brand name protection. There's supply chain and transportation management. As we add increasing numbers of segregations to the marketplace, it becomes a burden to the handlers that have to move this product. For wheat, we're already segregating by grade, by protein, by falling number, by different characteristics that are important to our customers. And the ability to have the storage and the logistical supply chain in place to handle non-GM, GM wheat, organic wheat, whatever it might be, is also a very important factor. And the establishment of marketing rules. Thresholds are going to be a key for us as we move forward. So we need to look at what are acceptable threshold levels, because zero just is not possible when we look at the bulk supply chain in the United States. We have tolerances for everything in our grading system and our non-grade factors. Grade number 2, for example, has a tolerance for wheat of other classes. We have a tolerance for total defects. Customers specify a tolerance for screenings. I mean, there does have to be a tolerance when we're talking about moving a product through a bulk supply chain. And we also want to look at consumer choice, as I mentioned, and just get into a little bit more detail about consumer choice. In the United States, the latest survey that was done in 2010 put acceptance of biotech wheat products at 80% if it was produced in a more sustainable method. Through reduced pesticide use, through better use of land resources, there was an overwhelming majority of consumers that were comfortable with biotech wheat products. And product choice for our producers as well. We often talk about customer choice, but sometimes I think we forget that producers have choices as well. And producers can always choose to plant whatever they prefer, whatever they think the market desires. So providing a choice of biotech crops or non-biotech crops or organic production, and 76% of wheat producers polled back in 2009 wanted to explore biotech wheat. They saw that as something that would be beneficial to them if the market would accept it. And in the United States, we've seen biotech acceptance of other crops grow at a very extraordinary rate. Today, soybeans are over 90% genetically modified in the United States. Corn is in the high 80s. Cotton, canola, sugar beets, all of those crops have been readily adopted by producers and have a very large percentage of that acreage being planted into biotech crops. Again, segregation systems and testing procedures are very important. One of our principles is having quick, applicable, inexpensive tests that can provide assurances to our customers with tolerances that they are receiving the product that they want, if that is the desire. Low-level presence for the asynchronous approvals of biotech crops. There are a lot of biotech traits moving through the pipeline, and the regulatory approval systems in different countries have different timing and different needs. So having a low-level presence is very important, as well as a threshold for adventitious presence once that product has been approved in the marketplace. And labeling as well, providing that choice. Voluntary labeling is a possibility as long as that labeling is truthful and not misleading. That would be, I think we can see that as another avenue to providing customer choice. So looking at what's happening in the world longer term, we've been doing a lot of work looking at 2030 and 2050 scenarios for what wheat demand might be and how we might meet that demand going into the future. So we look at the green line here as acreage, being flat, stagnant, as we've discussed already. And we look at population growth in the red dots, possibly reaching 9 billion people by 2050. And we look at the blue line of wheat demand. We can see wheat demand and population growth going pretty much hand in hand. So we have to figure out some way or another to increase productivity from today's roughly 670 million metric tons to 900 million metric tons in the next 40 years. So we definitely need to be looking at new technologies to meet that demand, to provide food security, and to provide that choice to customers around the world. I should go back and mention that it's not just biotechnology when I talk about new technology. These research companies are looking at all sorts of different options. There's double haploid technology, which greatly reduces the amount of time to bring a new wheat variety to the marketplace. There's the marker-assisted selection that I've mentioned previously as well. There's the hybrid wheat that we've seen just major advances in yield with corn from hybrids. Also would have some possibilities for wheat. So there's a lot of different scenarios, and biotechnology is just one of those factors that we need to look at. So looking at the future, we have a growing population. We have limited land resources. And we have a timeline of when does biotech wheat move forward. Mid-1990s, first biotech crops being planted. 2012, there still is, or 2011, there's still no biotech wheat in the world. Our estimates today is that biotech wheat is at least 10 years away. That puts us today, we're 15 years behind corn and soybeans. If we're 10 years away yet, that's 25 years behind corn and soybeans. If we're not talking about biotech wheat today, how much more time do we lose to keep our competitiveness with other crops and to meet the food security needs of the world going forward? We need to work together. We need to have an informative, transparent dialogue. We need to have regulatory approval systems that function, and we need to have tolerances in place for this to all work. And with that, I'll end my presentation and look forward to your questions.